Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Lady from South Shields for the constructive and informed way that she opened this debate. Yeah. Funeral poverty remains a pressing issue which I know affects far too many of our constituents. And I've spoken in debates on this matter on every occasion that has arisen since I was first elected in 2015. And I've spoken to far too many of my constituents in North Ayrshire and Arran who have been deeply distressed by the costs of burying their loved one. But it's also, as the Honourable Member for Southend West pointed out, it's also one of these issues around which there is a rare amount of consensus, because we all recognise this is an issue which cuts right across party boundaries. But the matter I keep coming back to in these debates is when a family loses a loved one, through the shock and fog and bewilderment of grief, the human instinct is to give the person that you have lost the best, the most dignified send-off that you possibly can. There is nothing else that you can do for them. And so often, understandably, thoughts about the cost of that funeral simply don't factor into your considerations at that time of grief. But it's only later, when the grief is still very raw, it's only later that the reality of the debt, the reality of the cost of that send-off becomes apparent. And too often, for too many people, the anxiety over this debt actually mitigates and works against and interferes with the entire grieving process. What we can all agree on is that for those on benefits and low incomes, help with funeral costs have not kept pace, and we've heard about this today. They have not kept pace with the cost of funerals. And this must be a cause of great concern to all of us. And we have probably all in our constituencies witnessed the anxiety of those struggling to pay for funeral costs for their loved one as they battle through their grief. And as we've heard from the Honourable Member for Southend West, as well as the huge variations in the costs of funerals, it's important to remember as well that funeral plans are simply not realistic for those struggling week on week to put food on the table. It's also the case that those over 50 plans that we hear about can mean that those on low incomes may pay thousands upon thousands of pounds over many years, with the full amount paid in never recovered by families when they've paid in more money than the funeral actually costs. But now that the responsibility for funeral payments have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament, I look forward to a much more well-rounded and compassionate approach to support for bereaved families who struggle with these costs. The SNP Scottish Government plans that the Funeral Expense Assistance Benefit will replace the current DWP funeral payment by summer 2019, with an additional £3 million to support yet another 2,000 people each year who would have received, under the old scheme, no support at all from the DWP. And also they're looking at uprating the flat rate part of that payment to take inflation into account, unlike in the rest of the UK, where, as we've heard from the Honourable Member for South Shields, where the payment has been frozen since 2003 at £700, which is a help, but is woefully unequal to the task of helping families with these costs. The SNP Government will also ensure that guidance is provided on funeral costs, funeral planning, and strengthening consumer protection with regards to funeral plans, with real efforts to tackle funeral poverty, working with credit unions and delivering a social innovation fund. Funeral poverty is a cruel and bitter obstacle to grief. Coping with the loss of a loved one is bad enough, but we know that 12% of people, 1 in 8 people, report that they've got themselves into debt trying to pay for a loved one's funeral. And it's simply not acceptable in this increasingly unequal society in which we live. People often cannot afford to live, and now, it seems, they cannot afford to die, as I have pointed out in every single debate on this since 2015. I am heartened by the measures being taken by the Scottish Government on this issue, and I would urge the Minister today to at least study carefully the proposals being put forward by the Scottish Government and try his best to do all he can to match this commitment to supporting bereaved families at their most vulnerable time.
Thank you,
Mr. Streeter. The inevitability of death